orientation on Monday that today and probably into Friday what we're going to be doing is focusing primarily on terminology, kind of getting a foundation for concepts that we'll be referring to throughout the semester. So again, a lot of kind of writing for right now, but again, these are key terms that it's important that we all be familiar with. Anyway, this course is Lifespan Human Development, so it's important that we define what human development is. It is the scientific study of changes in individuals, physical, social, emotional, and cognitive through the life cycle. It also focuses on the ways that people stay the same. The scientific study of changes in individuals, physical, social, emotional, and cognitive through the life cycle. It also focuses on the ways that people stay the same. All right, we want to take a look at, while you're writing that down, take a look at each part of that definition. Now, first off, what does scientific study imply? Just a real quick reaction. What scientific study imply, do you think? Anyone? It's okay to answer. All right, and we're going to look at that in a little while, but you're exactly right. It is looking at a process for understanding something. And so one of the important things is we look at the material that we're going to cover this semester. Scientific study implies that the information that we're going to present has a research base to it. It's not just my opinion or someone else's opinion, as right as it may sound, that there is some basis for the content that we're going to be covering. And we're going to talk a little bit about theory in a little while, and a little bit about what research is and how those two come together. So again, the knowledge that we're going to present, or the information that we're going to present to you over the course of the semester, both in class as well as in your textbook, is rooted in scientific research. What do you think is the most important word in this entire definition? If you're going to pick out just one word as we think about human development, what human development is all about. Changes. Exactly. Our focus, for the most part, during the semester, as we think about, and we often refer to human growth and development as often the terms that we'll refer to. And both growth and development, almost by definition, implies change. And so as we look at changes in an individual, that will be our focus. And so we're going to look at those changes in 4 major areas, and we're going to refer to those, and we're going to define each one of those in a moment. But we refer to them as the developmental domains. Your paper is going to focus in your own personal experiences on these 4 developmental areas: physical, social, emotional, and cognitive. And like I said, we're going to define those in a moment. So they're the areas of development, they're the areas that changes take place, and again, over the life cycle. Again, this is a lifespan human development course. We're going to look at conception through death, the whole life cycle of an individual. Now, our focus primarily is going to be on changes, but also we will make some mention about something and those aspects of development that remain relatively stable, that don't change dramatically over the course of our lives. For example, our personality, our temperament. We may modify those over the course of life experiences, but they remain more stable than they change over our life course. So, human development, scientific study of changes in individuals, physical, social, emotional, and cognitive through the life cycle. All right, let's take a look at those developmental domains. First area that we're going to take a look at, and what we want to do right now is nothing more than give you a feel for what's included. So when we talk about physical development, what are we referring to? What are we focusing on? And we are going to kind of select, and as I mentioned on Monday, hit the high points. And so when we talk about physical development, one of the main areas that we're going to look at is what we refer to as growth. When we think of growth, what would be the 2 most obvious things that we focus on? Height and weight. So we talk about physical growth. For the most part, what we're going to do is look at, from the moment of, even in terms of conception, how does an individual change in terms of height and weight over the course of our lives? And at what point does growth really begin to slow down and to some extent remain the same? So we'll look at growth. We will also look at what we refer to as motor development. Motor development simply, and you don't need to necessarily write down this definition at this point, but when we talk about motor development, what we're talking about is the individual's ability to voluntarily control their muscles, to control movement, to perform certain physical acts. As we'll discover a little bit later on in the semester, we know that a newborn, most of a newborn's movement is controlled how? Anybody know offhand? Reflexes, exactly. And as the child matures and gets older, they gain more and more control over their own muscles and their own movement. Natural part of, again, this human development that we're referring to. We often talk about motor development in two areas. We talk about large motor, sometimes referred to as gross motor. You might want to just write gross in parentheses because in your textbook you may see that term frequently. And when we talk about large motor or gross motor, we're basically talking about the use of the large muscle groups, which would be arms, legs. And so real quickly, what would be a couple of activities that would involve large motor, gross motor? Walking, running, jumping, climbing, lifting, those kinds of things, again, that are using the large muscles. Now, when we refer to small motor, we also call it fine motor, using fine muscles, which would include what? Picking things up. Hands and fingers. You're exactly right. It's interesting when I mention it, a lot of times students begin to model it before they ever utter, a word. So when we think about fine motor, small motor, using the small muscles, we're talking about, again, the use of our hands and fingers. And again, we think about what's necessary to pick up things. What are some things that you do over the course of the day that involves your fine motors or fine muscle skills? Writing. What else? What would be another just activity that's going to use your hands and fingers over the course of the day? Eating, hopefully using utensils. If you throw anything, catch anything, is going to involve, again, using hands, fingers. For young children, the ability to utilize scissors and to manipulate scissors requires very coordinated fine motor skills. And we'll look at how that changes and how they develop over the course of our lifetime. We will also, in this area, look at development of organs and look at sensory changes, both in terms of how are the senses developed at birth and how do they change over the course of our life. For example, for me, and it's very obvious as you look, I now require glasses to see. I didn't need glasses when I was younger, but over the course of my development, had difficulty as my eyesight changed. My wife would tell you that my hearing has changed over the course of the last few years. The main developmental organ that we'll look at actually throughout the course of our lifetime is brain development and how the brain changes over the course of our lives. So when we look at physical development, we're going to look at change in growth, we're going to look at motor development, and then we'll look at development of organs, particularly the brain, and then look at sensory changes. So first, development of veins. Secondly, we'll look at social development. That refers to the interactions with others. We're going to make these very, very simple definitions. And so when we look at social interactions, mainly what we're going to be focusing on in here is how we get along, how we interact with our peers, and then also we'll focus on family relationships as well. Now, along with that, a big part of how well we interact with others, or the nature of our interactions with others, is dependent upon our social skills. And so we're going to be looking at how those social skills develop, again, over the course of our lives, and how they in turn impact our relationships with our friends as well as relationships with families. What would be an example of a social skill? What is a skill we need to interact effectively with other people? Just one skill. Listening, excellent. What would be another one? Just a skill required to get along well with others. Understanding. We'll talk a lot about how empathy and our ability to understand someone else's perspective impacts how we relate to someone else. Real quickly, a couple of others. What's a social skill? Something we need to know how to do that's going to impact how we relate with others. You mentioned listening. There's also the expression part of that. And then we could take that a step further and talk about, both in terms of listening and expression, how we deal with conflict. That's a social skill. Something as simple as being able to make a decision with another person is a social skill. You ever been with a group of friends and you're trying to decide something as simple as where we're going to go to lunch after class? And it seems like it takes forever, and finally the group just gives up and someone just decides. Social skill. Can we, with someone else, make decisions and then make good decisions? So, with social, we're going to look at how we interact, what impacts our interactions with others, and particularly, again, how do peer groups, how do friendships get formed, and do they change over the course of a lifetime as we get older? And as we'll discover, they do. So, physical development, social development. We will then also look at cognitive development, which is the ability to think, remember, understand, reason, and decide. So every time I mention the word cognitive, what we're really focusing on in real simple terms are thought processes. And again, as we're going to discover, is over time, really throughout our lives, but particularly during the early years, we see tremendous change in terms of how young children understand, see the world, think about the world very differently than adults do. And what we want to try to do is understand how that evolves, how that changes over time. And it's quite fascinating. We will then also look at emotional development. And so when we mention emotional development, we're going to focus on 3 or 4 key areas of that. The first one, simply, when we think about emotional development, has to do with emotional reactions. When do we first begin to experience different emotions? Real quickly, someone throw out, what are some emotions that we all, as human beings, experience? Frustration. Sadness. Excellent. What else? Happiness. Real quickly, a couple other just common human emotions. Anger. Excellent. Joy. Again, just common emotions. And what we want to do is understand, when do we first begin to experience those emotions? And more importantly, how do we learn what situations cause those emotions or influence those emotions? And more importantly, how do we learn to deal with, handle, manage those emotions positively? They're all human emotions, But one of the things we know is that very young children have difficulty handling frustration. The hope is by the time we become young adults, we have learned how to not experience anger, frustration, but how do we handle, respond to, manage those emotions in positive, constructive, healthy kinds of ways. So, as you begin to, and we'll start to begin to think about your paper, at different stages of your life, you're going to be asked to think about what are situations in your life that have created common frustrations. What are the things that make you mad? What are the things that make you excited and happy in your life? And then how do you react to those? Those are all a part of your emotional development. And do you react any differently today to frustrations than you did when you were 2? And my hope would be that there have been some changes in that progression, over time. So when we think about emotional development, one of the things that we're going to be dealing with is emotional reactions. Not going to say a lot now, but we will look at self-concept or self-identity. And here we're simply referring to how an individual sees, views, and feels about themselves. And again, we'll define all that in more detail. We'll look at factors that contribute to self-esteem issues. We'll look at how they change over time and how important that is to an individual's life. We will also look at personality. Now, personality, for the most part, has a very strong genetic component to it. But it is influenced, it's shaped by the experiences in our lives. A lot of times when we think about personality, we often think about personality traits. I want you to think for a moment, you don't have to respond, but how would you, in one word or a short phrase, describe yourself? Now, personality is one of those things that does tend to remain somewhat relatively stable, though we may learn over time to modify or learn to deal with our personalities differently. Now, one of the ways that I would describe myself, and when I mention this, a lot of people look at that and seem a little bit puzzled by it, is that I really am an introvert. I really prefer small groups. I actually create a great deal of anxiety to speak in front of people, even though that's what I do as a profession. I've learned to function in large groups. I've learned to be able to present in front of long groups. I enjoy doing it, but it takes a lot of energy from me. My preference, would be a small group of friends doing things together. An extrovert, on the other hand, enjoys large groups. They're outgoing. They enjoy parties. I can function in those environments, but it's not where I am most comfortable, nor that I most enjoy. I'm also very strong-willed, at least that's what others would say. I'm very independent. They would be other personality characteristics. You can answer for yourself or just others. Do you know what would be some other terms that we would use to describe a person's personality that can help us keep in mind what we're referring to? And they don't have to necessarily be your own, but what are some other terms we often use? Say it again. A scatterbrained. Okay. I know some who that would fit. Other just terms that we use to characterize, not necessarily yourself, but a person's personality. Any other words come to mind? Funny, humorous, excellent. What else? Sarcastic. All right. A couple of others. Often we use, again, outgoing. Some people are really highly motivated or driven, kind of as an aspect of their personality, of who they are. Some people are more dependent. We often think of people who are independent. Some prefer to be more dependent on others as a part of who and how they see themselves. So again, we'll often refer to the role that personality plays as a part of emotional development. Now, a part of or an aspect of personality is temperament. And we'll use this term frequently, particularly as we talk about young children. And we'll refer to the role that temperament plays in an individual's life. Largely inborn patterns that influence how a person responds, reacts to different situations, to different people. Again, it is a part of an aspect of personality. How many in here have siblings? Several of you do. Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you to personally, to comment on them or yourself, and you don't need to write these down necessarily. But when we talk about temperament, there are 9 aspects of temperament. And this is just to give you a feel, so when we use the word temperament, some of what we're talking about. And what I want you to do is just to visually image your sibling. Because many times, even though someone may have the same biological parents, are likely going to have very, very different temperaments. And temperament does tend to remain fairly stable, and who you are today probably is somewhat characteristic of the temperament that you've had your entire life. Now, I'm not going to go over every one of these, all 9 of these, but just to give you some examples, and again, you can think about yourself, and also maybe think about your sibling, and if you see any differences whatsoever. One of the ones we think of as aspects of temperament is activity level. Now, again, I don't know what yours is. My son is nonstop. He reminds me of the Energizer Bunny. He is nonstop, on the go, all the time. And even when he's more passive in his activities, he's still active. And he's really funny to watch because he'll go do this activity for a few minutes, and then he'll go do this one, then he'll come back and do this one, but he's constantly doing something. Very active, and has always been that way from day one. There are other children that tend to be more or less active, more inactive, more passive. Some people would look at it and say, well, they're just not motivated. Part of it may simply be that their basic temperament is just to be more laid back. They just kind of go with the flow differently, and aren't necessarily driven to always be doing something. I use the term that I like, and I don't know that I coined the term, but I'm very good at it, and that's being. I like to sometimes just be, which simply means do nothing. I can sit and do nothing. I can even sit and do nothing and not even think about something for relatively long periods of time. Some people, it drives my wife crazy. She is on the go, 90 to nothing, all the time. So when we think about temperament, activity levels will differ. Regularity refers to how much an individual likes patterns, consistency, and routine. Now, we know that most young children like predictability, they like patterns, but as individuals become adults, some require that regularity and that pattern more consistently than others. Some children are not fazed by change. Someone shifts the schedule on them today and it doesn't matter to them. They just go with the flow. Other children, you change that routine, you change that schedule slightly, and they become very frustrated, disoriented by that. Some kids are more sociable. I'm sure, and I don't know about yourself personally, but I know all of you have probably been around a young child who never met a stranger, never been frightened by anyone. They'll go up to anyone, talk to anyone. And you have other children that are less sociable, more cautious, more hesitant around individuals. Sensitivity. My son is highly sensitive. And I don't necessarily consider it a good or a bad thing. It's just a part of his temperament. He's very much aware of other people around him, what they're feeling. Most importantly, he's aware of what other people think and feel about him. He's one of those children, you raise your voice to him and he's going to react. He's going to be very unsettled by that. And it's interesting in school as he learns to adjust to teachers that have different temperaments and different personalities. And he's getting very good at it, or much better at it. But there are other children, you raise your voice, you scream and shout at them, unfazed. Nothing kind of bothers them. And again, it's just a matter of how sensitive you are to situations and circumstances. Persistence. Again, there are some individuals who are persistent. They will stick with something till the bitter end. And there are other individuals, they try something once, it doesn't work, they're done with it. So again, these are just some of the aspects, characteristics of temperament, inherited, tend to be mostly influenced, inborn characteristics. They do get shaped by experiences, but they remain, I think, relatively stable throughout your life. As you think about your siblings, and you don't need to give specifics, anyone discover different temperaments than your siblings in any one of those 9 areas? Anybody think of an example of how they may be contrasted? I saw several people shake their heads yes. May not want to comment. Anyone? Just how they saw one aspect different than their sibling?
Outgoing on my sister, but I think that's pretty much the same.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so you were a little bit more outgoing.
Yeah, but I think that's probably because I've been in college and I'm used to it.
Okay, different experiences help shape or modify that differently. Anyone else? Just differences in temperament that they've noticed in their sibling or one of their siblings?
I'm pretty much totally different from my sister. Activity, sociability, intensity, everything. We're like pretty much opposite.
Okay. Again, just a good example about how you're kind of almost on opposite ends of the spectrum. And again, it's not an issue of right or wrong, just differences in activity levels, intensity levels, even persistence possibly. Some individuals are much more easily distracted by things. Others can stay focused for long periods of time. Again, you don't need to write this down, but again, as we look at that definition of human development and talk about looking at changes over the course of the life stages, these are the stages that we'll be covering during the course of the semester. These are from your textbook. Like I said, I'm not going to ask you the stages, but I just wanted to give you a reference point. Because what we're going to do as we move through the semester, what we're going to do is we're going to look at each one of these stages, and we're going to look at physical, social, emotional, cognitive development in each one of these stages. And look at what changes as we go from one stage to the next. If you look at a number of different sources, you'll see some variations in terms of when one stage begins and the other ends. Like I said, this is the one that's from your textbook. It's the one that we'll refer to. In many cases, for example, with adolescence, a lot of times it's real hard really to put a chronological age on a stage. We do that to give us a way to organize, but it's hard to say that, we know that not every child at 11 actually starts adolescent, or that once you turn 21, you're then a young adult, necessarily. So a lot of times it's hard to really define clearly chronologically when a stage begins and when one ends. But it will give us a way to kind of organize, our discussion. Now, one of the other things that we want to understand as we look at these developmental areas and as we look at changes from one stage to the next is to understand we will, and I'll present them kind of physical, social, emotional, and cognitive, and I don't have this on a slide, so you may want to write this down, but is to remember that these areas are all interrelated. We may talk about them separately, but they all are impacted by one another, and they don't happen isolated from one another. We may discuss them that way, but emotional development will affect social development. Social development is impacted, emotional impact is impacted by physical development, and likewise cognitive development will impact or be impacted by the other three as well. So they operate together. They're interrelated. One's impacting the other. You take a child who may be small for their size in terms of physical growth for their age group. And what that may do is have some impact on how others respond to him. Things that may be said to him that in turn may impact his emotional reactions and his self-concept. Which may then also impact how he processes and sees things in the world. All four of those are interrelated, impacting one another. And we want to keep that in mind as we move through our discussion. All right. Human development goals. Like I said, we're just looking at a lot of basic concepts. One of the things that human development attempts to do, again, as a scientific study, is to describe. And what we want to do is to describe the normal range of behavior. Now, real simply, can someone think of a reason why that might be helpful? Why might it be helpful to know what a typical 2-year-old is capable of doing? Or what would be typical 2-year-old reactions?
Help predict what to plan for or prepare for.
Exactly. So that we know that our responses or our reactions would be appropriate. So that we don't put expectations that are unrealistic on a child. When I think of this one, the one that comes to mind for me is potty training. One of the questions I get asked a lot from parents is, well, when is the right age to potty train? Or I'll get the parent that'll say something like, by golly, I'm going to potty train my child by the time they're 12 no matter what. Now, what I've found both in terms of my own experience as a parent but also professionally is that there is a time, it's not the same, it will vary, but there's a range of time when most children tend to be potty trained. And when the child is not only physically but cognitively, emotionally, and socially ready, potty training will occur pretty quickly. If you attempt to do that too early, you can create a great deal of frustration both on the part of the child as well as on the part of the parent or the adult that will only prolong that aspect of development. And so it's important that we have some general idea. I was reading an article the other day, and a parent was concerned that their child wasn't walking yet. And so what happens is parents a lot of times will read, that, well, my child started walking at 11 months. It's not out of the range, that's typical. But also it's not uncommon for some children not to walk until they're 14, 15 months. So it's important to know what the range is to know what's expected so that we don't put unrealistic expectations or become unnecessarily concerned. But when we find out that a child may fall out of that typical range, then we can monitor and watch that differently and then decide whether maybe we need to intervene. Maybe a child's language development tends to be delayed. Maybe there's something we need to help that child maybe catch up. But we want to make sure that it's out of that normal range and that we don't put unrealistic expectations on that individual child and create unnecessarily frustration. So one of the things that human development attempts to do is to say within different stages, here are the behaviors, here are the characteristics, physically, socially, emotionally, cognitive, that would be characteristic of children at this age. And it helps us kind of know what that range is. A lot of variation from one child to the next. It also attempts to explain what causes or influences behavior. I was reading the Springfield Mayor's report on the Council on Children on aggression. They did a study looking at the increased aggressiveness of kindergartners. So one of the things that human development as a profession, as a scientific study would want to do is to look at, if that is true, what are some of the factors that impact or might impact why children are becoming more aggressive by the time they reach kindergarten. Real quickly, what might be a factor? We don't know it, but it could be a factor that influences aggressiveness in young children. Any thoughts? Could be TV and video games and the amount of time that children spend. Maybe one factor that we might look at and study. What might be another factor? What their home life is like. How much aggressiveness is exhibited within their own home could be a factor. One more. Another factor that might play into aggressiveness in children. Anybody think of another one? Again, remember as we look at all the developmental areas, it could have something to do or be related to their peer group, who their friends are. Who are they interacting with and the behaviors? Is there a lot more aggressiveness in their interactions that may impact that. It could be related to, or a factor could be maybe not having developed the skills necessary to deal with frustration or anger, not learning some of those social skills that are necessary. So again, human development attempts to provide explanations for certain types of behavior. Likewise, human development attempts to predict. And again, not absolute predictions, but we have some indication that based on who we are, where an individual as a particular stage of their development, where they likely may be or how they may be influenced at a future time. You know, I was reading an article in the paper, one came out today, there have been several articles recently, you know, looking at obesity as a society. And one of the things that we know, and we'll talk about this more in detail later on in the semester, is that young children develop eating patterns very early in life. And we know that if there's not some intervention, some changes in those eating patterns, that they'll likely continue many of those patterns well into adulthood. We can kind of predict that. And we also know that overweight children are at a greater risk to be overweight as adults. We can make those kinds of predictions. We know that there are some things that, again, apart from intervention, that if a child is really struggling with self-esteem issues as a young child, and we don't do some things to modify that, it will impact them later in their lives. Likewise with intellectual development. Where a child is developmentally, cognitively at a certain stage can impact where they're going to be at a later stage. So again, we can make some predictions with some accuracy based on current development and how that will impact later development. And the last thing it attempts to do is to modify. Intervention to promote optimal development. If we're aware that a child maybe has got language delays, then what are some things that we can do to help that child catch up? Where can we intervene? Speech therapy, exactly. We also know that if we discover a child who is, as I mentioned earlier, a kindergartner who is very aggressive, we know that if we don't make some modification, some intervention, will likely continue to be aggressive. So how do we modify, how do we help that child maybe learn some social skills, learn how to deal with those situations that may be prompting that aggressive behavior, knowing that if we don't do some modifying, some intervention, that the child may deal with those behaviors much later in their lives. So human development goals. Describe normal range of behavior, explain what causes or influences certain behaviors, predicting later development based on earlier development, and also modify. How can we intervene in situations to promote optimal development, which is ideally our goal. All right, like I said, lots of terms. When we talk about change, we often think about change in two primary ways. And we will use these terms periodically during the semester. We often will talk about quantitative change. Again, real simply, in order to determine if something is quantitative or not, is there a change in number or amount? So again, when we're looking at changes emotionally, socially, cognitively, physically, quantitative changes are changes that involve number and the amount of something. Can you put a number to it? Now again, when we think about quantitative change, what would be the most obvious that falls within that category? Height and weight. Again, that's a quantitative change. One of the other ones that's been common in my experience as a parent is my son's shoe size. Continues to change. It seems like we go through numerous pairs of shoes in a year. He goes through shoes before he ever wears out a pair, as is, and I'm hoping that eventually is going to stop or stabilize, or that means that he's going to get to be 6'5". But so far his height hasn't caught up with his shoe size yet. Quantitative change would refer to vocabulary. We know that when a child begins to speak their first word, we know at a certain age that they'll speak X number of words, and so we can look at the number of words that an individual can speak and how that changes. That's quantitative change. Can we put a number and an amount to it? However, much change is more qualitative. This is change in kind, structure, or organization. These are much more reflective of transformation. These are things that we know are changing. Change occurs. We're aware of the change, but we can't necessarily put an amount or a number on it. And like I said, most of probably the changes that we'll be looking at are going to fall within this realm of qualitative change. When we look at cognitive development, as we look at thought processes, we can look at quantitatively maybe how an IQ score changes. But when we really look at how a person sees and understands things, that reflects more of a transformation. It's an evolution. We can see how a 2-year-old sees and understands the world is how it's different than a 5-year-old and different than an adolescent. But we can't put a number or an amount on that. We can look at how peer groups, friendships evolve and change over time, and how they may become more interpersonal over time. We can talk about the number of friends, quantitative, how that changes. But in terms of the nature of that friendship, that's qualitative. We'll look at self-concept, and we know that self-concept will move through stages of a person's life. Or identity changes, and how a person sees themselves will evolve over time. But you can't put a number or an amount on a person's self-esteem or on their identity per se. So there's certain aspects that are quantitative. We can put numbers and amounts to them, but much of the changes that we're going to be talking about is more qualitative. Transformations, change in structure, organization. This one we've already mentioned several times, but again, whenever we refer to the term growth, we saw that when we defined it as an aspect of physical development, we're generally simply referring to physical changes. Again, height and weight. All right, we're almost done with terms, and I know you'll be glad. A term that I think creates the most confusion for students, because you tend to equate the term with maturity, and that's not totally inaccurate. But when we talk about maturation, we're going to compare maturation to learning. Again, very important concepts in terms of looking at human development. Maturation refers to the unfolding of a natural genetically influenced sequence of physical changes and behavior patterns. An unfolding of a natural genetically influenced sequence of physical changes and behavior patterns. Now this is probably the most important part of the definition. When we talk about maturation, we're talking about changes that are relatively independent of the environment. Now, what's key here is relatively. It doesn't mean that the environment has no effect whatsoever. It does. But for the most part, maturation are those changes that are going to take place anyway. I mean, something as basic as a person's physical growth. Clearly, we know nutrition plays a role in that. We know that the level of activity plays a role in that. But for the most part, how tall I become is largely genetically influenced. Can somebody think of something else that's just a part of human development that's just going to occur now? When it occurs, rate, timing may vary, but it's pretty much maturationally defined. Anybody think of an example? You've all experienced it at this time in your life. Everyone will experience it. You were probably about 11 or 12. Puberty. Puberty is a natural unfolding process that will occur. Now, there are environmental factors that may influence the timing of that. But maturation, that puberty is one of those things that all of us experience. It's a natural part of the genetic aging process. In fact, aging itself, we in fact get older every day. It's a natural part. Now, the quality of our aging, that may vary depending upon choices we make, other environmental factors. But just the aging process alone is controlled by maturation, that natural human genetic process. To a large extent, people want to think that, man, I helped my child walk. The reality is most children, if given simply the opportunity for movement, will walk. They'll also move through a fairly natural sequence of walking, largely on their own. It doesn't mean that parents or caregivers or other adults can't influence that to some extent, support that along, but for the most part that happens pretty naturally. Likewise, when baby teeth come in, fall out, again, a natural part of maturation. Now, however, there are changes that clearly are the result of learning. And apart from experiences, the individual are likely not be able to obtain that knowledge or those abilities. So these are changes that are the result of experience rather than the result of maturational process. Now again, it doesn't mean that maturation doesn't play a role. It clearly does. They are related. But what it does suggest that apart from some specific experiences, this learning would not take place. Can you think of a couple of simple examples? What are some things that an individual learns to do, acquires the knowledge or ability that requires some type of experience? Anybody? Any of the academic abilities, reading, writing, math, apart from probably someone teaching you to do that, having some type of instruction, some type of experience, you're probably not on your own. If you are isolated from those experiences, would acquire that ability. Excellent. A couple of other simple examples. Talking to a certain extent. We know that there are some maturational aspects in terms of brain development, but apart that if you never had any interaction with other individuals, that experience, and heard someone speak words to you, you probably wouldn't acquire language. Excellent. One other example. What's something else that you learned?
Like learning yourself, like on stove.
Okay.
You're a little kid.
Yeah, and how you react to that and what you learn from that experience. Won't touch it again. You probably maturationally aren't going to know, hot, don't touch. It's that first time you touch it, it burns. That was the experience that taught you that wasn't a good move. And likely, hopefully, not do that again. Excellent. Good example. Okay, so we've got some changes, some development occurs primarily as a result of maturation, others that are primarily the result of learning experiences in our lives. All right. There are some what we call developmental issues. Now, I refer to these kind of as almost representative of debates that take place. And these are developmental issues in terms of, and I refer to them as debates in terms of which of these two poles has the greatest influence on development. Now, the first one I call classic. The classic nature-nurture debate, i.e., which one has the greatest influence? And we'll ask that, or at least think about that individually for a second, and then we'll attempt to answer that. Nature versus nurture. Nature is the effect of heredity. And nurture is the effect of the environment. And that's what you need to know most importantly, which is which. Now, every time I think of the classic nature-nurture development debate, I think of an old movie that came out a number of years ago. It's been replayed on TV fairly frequently, called Trading Places. Anyone ever see the movie Trading Places? Had Dan Aykroyd in it and Eddie Murphy. I told you it was classic and it was old. Anyone at all remember that movie? Do you remember what the essence of it was? Just
The poor guy switch places with the rich guy and see if they ever change it.
exactly. I mean, the bottom line, it was a movie, like I said, with Dan Aykroyd, Eddie Murphy in it. Eddie Murphy was, when you first see him come into the movie, was a poor guy on the streets, kind of panhandling, kind of manipulating others, to try to get by. And basically, if you were to look at his background, would probably not have been the most healthy, most positive, though we don't know a whole lot about it. You have Dan Aykroyd that would come from what people would refer to as good breeding. Came from a strong family background, went to an Ivy League university. And you have these two older gentlemen. And these two older gentlemen have a bet. I guess you're the only one who saw it. You remember what the bet was for how much? Anyone? $1. They have a $1 bet. And their bet was on the debate about nature and nurture. One believed that it didn't make any difference what your background was. If you had a good background, if you had good genes, so to speak, versus bad genes, that didn't make any difference. You put yourself in the right environment, you're going to succeed. The other one said, no way. Doesn't matter what that it's your breeding. It's your genetic inheritance. And if that's not strong, it doesn't make any difference what your background is. You will not succeed. So they had this $1 bet, and so what they do is they take these two individuals and they swap places with them. And my basic belief is at the end of the movie is what we really discover, though the movie really had no redeeming value other than to be kind of a humorous comedy, is that really is what we know about nature and nurture. What do you think, real quickly? Which do you think has the greatest impact? Or do you think one has more of an impact than the other? Any opinions at all?
I think that them
Yeah, I think most times when students react or think about it, the reality is what we do know is that both play a key role. You know, that you really can't separate the two and say that it's one or the other. I think the vast majority of students I had, most I think would lean to say that nurture probably maybe plays maybe a little bit stronger role, or at least clearly plays a significant role. I would use the analogy of rubber bands. You know, and you take a relatively small rubber band compared to a very large rubber band. And if you think about the rubber bands as being our genetic inheritance, our kind of basic natural abilities, you know. And I could have a lot of natural abilities. You know, I could have that large rubber band, you know. But if I don't do anything with those abilities, that rubber band's not going to be stretched. And I'm not going to develop those abilities to its fullest potential. You know, but I might be someone else, you know, who didn't have maybe a lot of natural intelligence, so to speak, or athletic ability or artistic ability, you know, but given the right environment, the right encouragement, the right learning experiences, the right motivations, you know, I may be able to actually stretch what my capabilities are much further than someone who did nothing with what they had. You know, so I think they both clearly, in our discussion, is going to suggest that they go together. They interact together. They aren't apart. We clearly know that there are some aspects, such as personality, you know, that clearly have a genetic predisposition. But how those get played out in our life are going to be influenced by the experiences we have in the environments that we live in. So clearly, they go together. And that's going to be our position. We're not going to separate them, but believe that nature and nurture work together. Likewise, there are some who say that as individuals that we are active participants in our development. That you and I influence who we become. That we are active role players in that. There are others who say that we really don't have a lot of impact. You know, that the environment, our experiences shape who we are, and we are passive participants in that. Likewise, I would suggest that it's probably a little of both, that they interact. That there are aspects that we play a much more vital role in shaping our development, and there are aspects that we may be more passive participants in that, and that they really go together. But there are clearly some who will go on either side of that argument. And finally, there are some that suggest that development is continuous. It just evolves. That you really can't necessarily see an ending and a beginning or a middle. It just is an ongoing, continuous evolution of change. As you'll see when we start to look at the theories in this class, that there are others would suggest that there are distinct stages. You know, and that you can mark when we move from one stage to the next, and that there are characteristics of each one of those stages. And those are stage theories, and we'll look at some of those. Again, what I would suggest is that there are some things that are probably easier to understand in stages. But probably the reality is that there is a continual evolution as we move from, or evolving as we move from one stage to the next. And there clearly isn't some defining moment that marks when this stage ends and the other begins. But it's only a way of helping us understand or organize our understanding differently. So probably it's a combination of both. So nature and nurture, I think, work together. I think we're both active participants in our development and at times passive. And probably we can understand some things in stages. But the other flip side of that is probably when we look at many aspects of development, it's continuous evolution of change over time.